All right. Hey there, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Ben Brown. I'm the president of Praxis, for those of you who don't know me. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Brian Albrecht, who is the chief economist at the International Center for Law and Economics. He'll be speaking, as you know, on market power, monopolies, and how that creates competition and welfare for an economy. Please welcome Dr. Albrecht.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. I went to a small liberal arts college in a small town, so it felt like coming home a little bit coming here, especially coming to Hillsdale and all it means in its unique place. So really excited to talk about market power. This is an early project. Don't believe everything I say. I'm going to try to spin some data together to tell a story, but this is early. I'm trying to work out, what's going on in the data. I'm assuming in this group there are people who are generally fans of markets. Not everyone, but people tend to be that way. I'm going to try to delve in a little bit more about what we can say about markets working, what we can say about the causes of economic growth. Okay? So what I have plotted up here is GDP per capita for all the decades between 1950 and up through 2010. The decade ended in 2010. Okay? All of them starting at year 0 up through year 9. Any guesses which line is which decade? Yeah.
I'm going to guess orange is the 90s.
Orange is the 90s? Why do you say that?
I mean, I'm guessing because the internet created a bunch of economic progress, and so it would be the decade of the biggest growth.
It's one fairly plausible guess. We've noticed a drop here at the end of a decade. Does anyone know a decade that had a big drop at the end of it? The 2000s. 2000s, okay. But this one's actually the 60s. This is the 2000s. But the rest of them, it's kind of besides like a big drop in a particular year, the rest of it is just upward growth. It's not quite clear what's happening. And what I'm going to argue today is the forces that drive this, decade after decade, the forces that are driving economic growth within the United States is what I'm going to call competition. I'll be explicit about what I mean by that. Right? The fact that if we look at GDP on a log scale, it's been growing linearly. This data goes back to 1947. It teetered off, it seemed a little bit in the 2010s, but it's roughly constant. If we go back even further, we go back to 1890 with some other data, same sort of thing. Year after year with some major problems, Great Depression, this data ends in 2010, so we got the Great Recession here, okay? But the big overarching picture is that within the United States, okay, and I'm stressing the United States for a particular reason, within the United States, something is working. And what is that thing? Okay? And it's not just working at kind of an average level. Across the distribution, we see similar progress. Okay, this is from a forthcoming paper that really is about inequality, but I think this is the most striking figure. Okay, this is debated, but roughly what they do is they try to divide income between the top 20%, middle 20% in there, 40 to 60, and the bottom 20%. The dashed lines are before taxes, the solid lines are after taxes. And if we look at after taxes, all the groups are moving up, okay? It's a little bit flatter for the before taxes on the lower group, but kind of an upward trajectory across the distribution, okay? So it's not just about a few rich people. There's been fundamental growth and prosperity across the distribution. And if we look at shares, it shows about the same thing. This is the easiest way to see that they're actually they're all kind of growing together. The bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, it's been right at that about 12% always, with the top being around 40 after taxes. Okay, so they're all growing together. If they're all growing perfectly together, these lines would be perfectly flat. They're all, every income quintile was growing at 2% per year, they'd be perfectly flat. If we look at more recent data, and this was not directly pulled from Fred, I'm stealing this off of a Substack I like, okay? If we look across countries, and we normalize Q3 of 2011 to 100, we have a recovery, and we have the US ahead of all of the G7, okay? Basically rich countries, okay? There's something going on in the U.S. economy year over year, short term, long term, that seems to be going well. There are ups and downs, but overall a very broad success. So what I'm going to argue today is try to make a causal argument. The first step is that there's some legal rules and institutions that help competition. Okay? That generates, depending on those legal rules, markets, the level of competition, and in the US case, it's meant that US markets have been extremely competitive. And from there, that competition is what gives this growth year over year, decade over decade. Okay? I'm going to focus until the end of the talk on really these last two parts. In many ways, I'm going to dodge the hardest question, is like, what exactly are those institutions? What exactly are those rules? But I'm going to give some evidence and argue that the U.S. is extremely competitive, and that's why we continue to see economic growth. Okay? And so I'm trying to be a little bit more subtle on this idea of like markets seem to be good in some respect. They seem to generate prosperity. If we look at North Korea versus South Korea, we see something pretty striking in South Korea that has markets. What is it about the markets that's actually doing that? Okay. And I'm going to argue, I didn't do a full theory talk. I'm a theorist by training. I didn't do a full theory talk. This is my few theory slides, theory-esque slides. If you want the math, we can talk about the math. The fundamental force that's driving this in the market economy, the fundamental force that's been unleashed decade over decade within the U.S. is what I'm going to call the Kersnerian entrepreneur and Kersnerian entrepreneurship. And the basic idea, we get this from Kersner, it's trivial when you break it down to such simple points, but it's buy low, sell high, make a profit. And this searching out for where can I buy something low, sell high, where can I make a profit? Okay, where do I have the information and the incentives to do that? That is what drives reallocation. So for a simple example, this is my attempt with throw it into ChatGPT to get a picture here. Imagine this is the model. This is the thing that actually can be put in math. We have apples over here that are free. They just fall from the apple, or sorry, they fall from the tree. Over here, they're selling for $1. No one over here sees that there's apples over here. Along comes an entrepreneur, sees both islands, starts bringing apples from here to here, arbitrages the opportunity away, okay? Until that price is driven down and there's no more free apples. Okay? The price differential is closed. This is fundamentally a reallocation from lower valued spots to higher valued spots. That's what markets do. That's the unique thing that markets do, is they give incentives, profit incentives, to move from lower to higher value. Okay? This simple analogy extends all over the place. And everywhere you look, you'll see it. Like consumers. Anytime a consumer finds a producer that's a lower price, higher quality, right? We can think about those as being equivalent. Okay? That's a Kersnerian discovery. And it leads them to reallocate their economic activity from the higher cost good to the lower cost good. We do this all the time when we're searching around. Producers, they find the same thing on the technological side. How to turn lower value goods into higher value goods. They're always looking for better ways to do that. Again, reallocating from more expensive inputs to less expensive inputs and trying to find more of that. Okay? So this force, it's kind of trite, kind of silly when we think of it as like this pure arbitrage, like literally no one can look across and see that there's an apple. It's just an analogy that then extends to all facets of life. Oh, where's there a profit opportunity? I'm going to go there. Where's there a better good? I'm going to find that. Okay, that's the fundamental force that is part of human nature, but markets change the way in which that's directed. Okay? And in both cases, both the consumer searching these out and the producer searching these out, what it's going to lead to, the new discovery, is the more productive and more efficient firms are going to get more customers. If you're able to sell lower, you're able to have higher quality, that's where more of the market will go. Okay? There are lots of things from technology, okay, policy that affect this matching process. Okay, and that's what's going to differ across countries. It's not that people differ across countries. policies and technologies are going to differ across countries, okay? And the U.S. has found a relatively successful, next step of the argument is that the U.S. has found a successful way of facilitating this matching. Okay? So just to kind of make it a little bit less abstract, right? When we think about, yes, these are two separate markets, goods, you know, in two different parts of the world, like something like a search engine. You know, you may not know that, oh, there's a store down, you know, in the town over. Or you may not know that there's an online company. You know, there's a guy out of his garage that's shipping the shoes you want or something like that. Okay, but a search engine opens that up. It's like discovering this new island. I guess this is the one you discovered, the new island. So technology as it evolves changes this up. Okay, and policy can get in the way. Or facilitate it, but it'd be easier to think about it getting in the way. You know, policy says any profit you make, we're going to take 100% of it. You're probably not going to take apples from left to bring to the right. Okay? If policy says something like, you know, they need to allow for that sort of discovery. Okay? But there's lots of other frictions that are a little bit more subtle. Some may seem like policy, may not. You know, does a firm on the left have cash to expand? Do you have, this is a little bit, I'm messing up the analogy because in that case you don't actually need any cash, the apples are on the ground. But imagine you had to buy them first and then sell them. What does that take? It takes capital. It takes a loan from someone or investment from someone. How do those markets work? Okay? Can you legally do it? There's lots of parts of the world where you're just not allowed to engage in certain transactions, including in the US. Okay? And if you are allowed to do it, do you know you're allowed to do it, or is it a gray area? Okay, you need to know that you can do this, and the government's not going to come and bat you over the head if you do this. Okay? And so is there uncertainty around the policy regime? Okay, these are all the things that are going to, in some sense, gum up the process of reallocating from low value to high value. Okay? More generally, those who's at Econ 101? Okay, most people. I hope your teachers have a demand curve and you have a supply curve. Right? You got that? Okay. That's imagining, okay, that everyone knows who the other traders in the market are. If that's true, you end up at this equilibrium point. Okay, where on the margin, the valuation on the demand curve is exactly equal to the valuation of the marginal cost on the supply curve. But in a world outside of this perfect information, okay, there might be things that get in the way so that there's the price that the demanders have to pay and the price that the suppliers receive aren't the same. Things like taxes, things like transportation costs, so on and so forth. And we can think of that as creating a wedge, a friction between the demand side and the supply side. And so there are people who value the good, people in here, more than the cost, but aren't able to discover it somehow. Okay? Now the question is, are there policies, are there changes that can shrink this? Mathematically, in the models, shrinking it down to zero, you end up here. Okay? If it's really, really big, say the government's going to shoot you if you trade, you know, no one's going to trade, you're going to be way over to that side. Okay, so we're thinking about kind of moving towards this really competitive market here when frictions are low, moving away when frictions are high. Okay, that's kind of the theoretical setup. Yeah. That's what I already said, that frictions go away, you go to perfect competition in this, again, this hypothetical world where there's no misallocation. All the goods are where they should be. Okay, so that's a theory of how there's reallocation within the market. If you're interested in the theory, again, I'm happy to talk more about it. But when we look at the data, what in the data shows up as this? Like, where does this come out? Yeah, it's a theory, but like, is there something in the data that we can look at to make sense of it? So I'm going to give some data on competitiveness and the problems associated with, you know, finding data on competitiveness, related to it productivity, okay, and then the output I basically already showed, but there's kind of a simple connection between these two. Okay? So again, my argument, markets are extremely competitive, that's what generates prosperity. Okay? But on what basis am I saying that markets are extremely competitive? Okay. Unfortunately, there's just not a universal way to measure competition. There's no agreed upon way of what that means. Okay. There are a few different ways that are used in the literature that economists talk about. One is if you've ever seen a Cournot model, it's kind of a simple model that you'd see in an I/O course or maybe a game theory course or something like that. You have start with 2 sellers, 3 sellers that are competing. I don't need to go into the details of the model, but in the simple setup, if you add more sellers, another seller falls from the sky. Where did it come from? I don't know. In the model, I'm the modeler, I can just throw someone in there. That's the joy of a model. You can just make stuff happen. Okay? In the model, I add another seller, that's more competition. Okay? Why does it make sense to call that more competition? Price is driven down. Okay? This gap between the value of buyers and the marginal cost is driven down. The markup, that gap, price over cost, is driven down, and profits are driven down. Not to zero necessarily, in the limit they're driven to zero, but it seems to capture in that model something like competition. People are making less profit, there's more consumer surplus, things like that. But in many other models, the mechanism is not that simple. Particularly the models that are used within the relevant fields of industrial organization, I'll talk about in a little bit, international trade, we kind of proxy for competition in the data. For example, it seems plausible that a reduction in trade, transportation, or search costs, we should call that more competition. Why? Just intuitively, if now it's easier to trade with a foreign country, technology allows us to trade with a foreign country, policy changes that, more of those goods are going to flow in. Now I'm a seller, I have to compete not just with the local market, but with the international sellers. Okay? Intuitively, it seems like there's more competition. Now it's not just my neighbors, it's the people 2 towns over, 5 towns over, all the way across the world. In many models, this also matches the Cournot example, where price is driven down, markups are driven down, profits are driven down. Okay? Lower trade costs, each individual firm has to compete harder. Okay? So we kind of have 2 general ways of thinking about competition. One is the number of sellers from the Cournot model. One is something like a transportation cost or some other proxy. Like, okay, the transportation cost isn't competition itself, but if the transportation costs drop, say because shipping costs drop or oil prices ultimately drop, okay, that induces more competition. But I'm not going to read the quote. Importantly, competition outside of the Cournot model is not concentration. That's not what I'm going to look at. That's what many people will look at. That's what some economists, not I/O economists generally, but some economists will look at concentration. How many firms are there? What percentage of the market share goes to the top 4 firms, the top 20 firms? The problem with that is it's not even a good proxy. We don't know which way it goes. In this type of a world, lower trade costs increase concentration. Now, the top firms sell locally, sell abroad, they win everything. If you're an inefficient firm, you're no longer protected from trade. Okay? So you lose out. So concentration, when trade barriers drop, concentration rises. Are we going to say competition goes up? No. Sorry, competition goes down because concentration rose? No, it's a bad proxy. So, what is something besides, if I don't want trade barriers, because it's kind of a weird thing, it's not actually the thing I want, I can't use concentration, it has theoretical problems. Okay, what is something that will work? And I'm going to argue that in if you're clever enough, this may not be true. But in basically every model you'll see in economics, whatever you're calling more competition, will reallocate more of the market, more output, to the more productive firms. Okay? That's true in the Cournot model. If you have a lower cost, if a firm is lower cost, they're going to get larger part of the market. It's true in all the other models that I've talked about in I/O and trade. Okay? That when there's competition, there's more of a winner-takes-all type of, may not be winner takes more of the market. Okay? So now we have market share as some, not market share itself. Market share may tell us something. In particular, it might tell us if there's a positive correlation between market share and productivity, a higher correlation there will show us something like more competition. It's always hard to compare across markets and whatnot, but in many plausible models, that's going to show up. Okay? In all of these cases, as output is going to shift towards more efficient firms. Average costs in the market are going to decrease. That seems like a sign of more competition. Okay, and this connection between output shifting to the more competitive firms is what's going to drive up productivity. Okay, everyone see this? I'm going to look at the correlation between market share and your productivity. So let's talk about what is productivity. Okay, you may have seen it in a class. We all kind of have an intuitive sense of it. It's a measure of how much, this is a typo, how much output a producer obtains from a unit of input. Okay, some measure of efficiency. There's many different measures, but all of them come out as, another typo, I must have just been not paying attention to this slide. Productivity is something about outputs over inputs. Okay? Outputs are going to be in the data, things like loaves of white bread. Okay? In some cases, we'll be able to go that granular. We'll be able to say like cubic yards of concrete. Okay? We'll be able to go to, of this grade concrete, actually, we'll be able to go to. Now I don't have this data. I'm drawing on a lot of other papers. Inputs are going to be things like labor hours, things like that. Sometimes there'll be dollars in revenue versus labor expenditure or something like that. But all of them is going to be an output over input. Okay? If you hold fixed inputs, you get more outputs. That's an increase in productivity. Okay? If you're comparing across two firms, same amount of inputs, different level of outputs, different level of productivity. Okay? And this productivity is going to matter because it's really the speed limit. It's the thing that's stopping economic growth. At the end of the day, you can't just have people work more and more to get more output. Okay? Or if you do, it's not going to be really prosperity in any sort of meaningful sense. You know, think of you as a person. You just keep working more and more and more. You know, at some point, yeah, that's great. It's good to go from 0 hours to 1 hour. It's good to go up to 40 hours, whatever it is. But at some point, working more for more output isn't a good thing. It's fixing hold. I'm working 40 hours a week. Our population is working 40 hours a week. How much output are we getting? That's productivity. Okay? We don't want to talk about just spending, working harder. We want to talk about productivity. That's what drives economic growth. Okay? So a few things about productivity and firms in general that you may not know. The first is that productivity across a variety of measures, but let's just think about this as labor productivity, output per worker hour, okay, differ immensely across firms and immensely across firms in the same very narrow industry. Two establishments, okay, two factories making white bread, sliced white bread, will differ in their productivity. So much so that there's roughly a 30% gap between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, okay, where we have the best data on this. What does that mean? That means if you take everything that the 25th percentile person is doing, 25th percentile factory is doing, you give it to the 75th percentile firm, imagine this hypothetical, overall output increases 30%. Okay? Output from those inputs increases 30%. It's even more extreme if we look at the tails Because the distribution looks like, I should, maybe I should have this. The distribution of productivity, okay, number of firms, across countries, across industries, this isn't a US statement. Across everywhere we look, it looks something like this. Okay? There's a few firms that are super productive, a few that are very unproductive, and a bunch that are kind of in the middle. If you compare the tails, we're talking about twice. Again, white bread, very, very similar goods. You can get, each worker, you get twice as much production from it. Each capital dollar, you get twice as much, okay? This isn't just about, oh, that factory has a bunch of robots and this one doesn't. Okay, you still get this big difference. So we have firms that are very, very different, and we have movement between firms. And this is true everywhere, but it's especially true in the United States. And one way to look at this is to look at where workers are going. Workers in basically every production you can imagine, workers are a key input. Okay? The flows between companies, the gross flow is about 10 times the net flows. What do I mean? Look at the last quarter that we have the best data on this. Job gains at the establishment level, okay, were 8.1 million. Just who all added a job? Raise your hand. Okay, I added 50 workers. I added this many. Okay, 8.1 million in a quarter in the U.S. Gross job losses, 7.8. So the number you hear on the news, the U.S. economy created X amount of jobs, is this net difference. Okay? But underneath that, there's huge amounts of people moving between jobs. Okay? Between companies. And if some firms are super productive and some firms are not productive, where do you want those people moving? To the more productive firms, right? That's going to create more. Take someone who's at a factory where they're not doing much, okay? Not producing anything, they got the same equipment as much as we can tell, move them over to a highly productive firm, output's going to increase. Okay? So, when I think about flows and productivity, are these things correlated? Do productive companies grow? If so, then overall companies are going to grow. Overall productivity is going to grow. If not, it's going to be much harder. Still possible, okay, but it's going to be much harder. And one way to see this is do a simple decomposition. So now I'm going to do the actual start thinking about the data a little bit more. If we take a market, white bread, okay, white bread in the United States in this quarter. The total market productivity, this is basic math, can be broken up into the average firm productivity. So just take up all the firms, you produce 3, I produce 5, you produce 8, average them out, there's some productivity level. Okay? And there's a covariance correlation, we can say, between market share, market size, and productivity. Okay? That is going to add up to total productivity. Okay? If market share and productivity is very high, that is that the most productive firm gets all of the market, we're going to have high overall productivity. Doesn't matter if you have low average productivity, if all those firms aren't producing anything, right? So they don't affect productivity. It's all about this covariance. If it's negative, it'd go the other way. You have highly productive firms that don't have much of the market share. Okay? And so this is what I'm going to think of as quantifying the allocation across firms as a level of competition. How much are we churning towards the more competitive, more productive firms? Okay? I'll just give quick pros of this metric. It's easy to compute if you have the data, which all the statistical agencies have. Okay, I don't have it, but if you go into the microdata, it exists. You know how big these firms are and things like that. Okay, and it gets rid of a lot of cross-country effects. The cons, this goes back to the concentration point, is this is just an accounting decomposition. the covariance itself doesn't tell me anything kind of directly. I have to back out it as a meaning of competition. Okay, but there's a few papers that I'm going to draw on that show in a very intuitive model that there is a nice connection between the two. That this is actually capturing what I called, competition before, things like trade costs. Okay? So just to make intuitive sense of this is from one of those versions of the Bartelsman paper. Okay? What I have here is that covariance. It's got a funny name here called the OP decomposition, but it's this covariance. And just an intuitive, does this kind of make sense? We have across a variety of Eastern European countries, just in manufacturing, and kind of early transition phase to a little bit later transition phase. Okay? Earlier in the transition, these numbers are negative. That means that more productive firms were smaller. How does that happen? The person running the more productive the less productive firm has some sort of political favor. Things are going their way. It's hard to grow if that's true. If you're, I don't know if anyone plays basketball here. If you're funneling the basketball to the bad shooter, your shooting average is going to go down. It's going to be hard to make a lot of points. Okay, that was what was happening in a bunch of countries earlier in the transition from communism. Okay? But after go more to markets, these numbers start to grow. The one difference is Estonia, and I don't know why that's true. They actually dropped Estonia in later versions of this paper. Maybe there's some issue with the data. But as we move towards markets, we move towards more competition, we move towards a higher covariance here. If we look, this is just a sanity check that this is capturing something about markets operating. Okay? If we look across some of those countries, but a few other we'll call richer countries, and I'll just look at this last version, this is from the published version. Okay, the covariance term for the US is, I'm not saying this number means anything to you, 0.5 by itself, but it's about twice as high as what we think of as relatively competitive, relatively market economies, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Netherlands. Okay? We're not talking about North Korea here. We're not talking about Chile. We're talking about rich countries. But the US is systematically able to, I should point out the time period here, this is the 90s, this is the latest we have the good comparison. A lot of this work is making these apples to apples comparisons. We can look at the number today, but it's a little bit harder. But let's say in the 90s, the US was really able to, way more than any other country, shift resources from low producing firms to high producing firms. Okay? So low productivity to high productivity. I say the US is able to do that, right? Entrepreneurs within the US under market system are able to do that. Okay? If we look across time, let's ignore this within for a second. Just look at the covariance. This is about that point. This is percentage of the this is about growth. Okay, so this is about levels. This is about growth. We see less of the growth coming from this covariance, so this shuffling around between firms, but it's still a big part. And in fact, the average productivity for a firm is dropping in all of these periods. So firms are getting less productive. The average firm is getting less productive, but the economy is still churning along because more of the goods are being allocated towards the more productive firms. Okay? This is net entry. It's a little bit more complicated when you need to think about firms that weren't there. Now this is huge. This is a big number negative, but what you need to remember about firms is that most firms are very small, and most firms then die out. 20%, 30% of firms within 2 years die out. So these are a bunch of firms that start, they're doing okay, they fall out, and so this term is negative. It should be there are ways of reweighting it where it's not as drastic. But any way of reweighting it, most of the growth is coming from reallocating. The market's able to reallocate, on average, in the U.S. to higher productivity firms. Okay, so that's my argument. This simple statistical point is very high in the U.S. Every way of measuring it, it's very high, and it's lower other places. And this is what is happening. This is the evidence of competition, okay, and what's happening in the U.S. Now, there's a lot of challenges to my argument. I want to go through them. Again, as I said at the beginning, I'm starting to work through this. This is, half-baked idea here. Right? Remember my argument, the main part of it. Markets in the U.S. are extremely competitive. That's what generates economic success and prosperity. Well, you could dispute this claim. You could dispute this claim. You could dispute the connection between them. That's the way you'd go after my argument. I'm going to start with disputing, are they competitive? I have one measure. The more common measure that you'll hear in the economic literature saying that markets are not competitive, the most common, I don't know why that can be summed up in this book called The Great Reversal, is that actually the U.S. markets are not competitive. In fact, they're becoming less competitive, and his argument was that Europe is actually overtaking us and that they're more competitive. I'm not trying to this is a very common argument. The U.S. actually isn't that competitive. There are problems with the market. For example, concentration over the last 40 years is rising. This is manufacturing, this is retail trade, wholesale trade services. Okay, these are different measures of concentration. All of them are going up. And this is the best data available. This is the census data. No one's getting better data than this. Okay? Concentration is rising. Concentration is rising, maybe that's a problem. Maybe that means that we're no longer competitive. This is what the Philippon book is basically relying on, these types of arguments. Remember, if you take anything from this lecture, concentration is not competition. Concentration is endogenous. Okay? When things are very competitive, you can have high concentration. When things are not competitive, you can have high concentration. It's not relative. It's not a good measure. And even on its own merits, it's not clear that concentration is rising. If you actually look at, this is all domestic. If you look at things like imports, okay, this is domestic concentration. This is the same one as we showed before. But if you look at market concentration from the consumer's point of view, kind of what we think about with mattering for the consumer, there's been enough increase in imports that's completely offset that. So the goods that a consumer can buy, not what the producer can produce, but what the consumer can buy, there's no more concentration. Okay. Another measure of competition is a markup, price over marginal cost. Okay. In the perfectly competitive model, often that's driven down to zero, not always, but often that is. There's a famous paper by DeLocre, Eckhout, and Unger that shows this is rising, and rising drastically over the last 40 years. Okay. Lots of problems with it. It's a great first start. It's an important paper. Okay. There's a huge debate around it. The way I come down on this huge debate is that actually these markups are not a sign of decreased competition. They're something like a return to technology. For example, what I have plotted here in a paper by Kirov and Trena is in the solid line is the marginal product of a worker, and the dashed line is wages. Okay, there's a big gap here now, but that's not because now wages are being driven down. Okay, the firm has invested a ton and is now able to get from each worker a lot more. It's really a return to the worker's investment. And when you account for that sort of dynamic, like a different paper does, markups are flat. Okay? So like profits, it's not quite profits. We can think of that as being flat. So I don't think that I think the U.S. economy is very competitive. Is it the most it's competitive it's ever been? I don't know. But the world is not falling apart. We're definitely not less competitive than Europe. That still goes through. In fact, I show in other work, these markups, the rise of them, is not correlated with entry and other things that we think of as being signs of a healthy market or reallocation. Okay, I won't go too much into that. A second challenge, okay, to this hypothesis is reallocation. Yes, it's high, but it's been slowing, okay, and it's slowed a lot, and so maybe that's a sign that things aren't so good. I'm gonna slide around a few different means of reallocation. It's not exactly it's not that all that covariance term, but generally reallocation. And I already showed this. If we look at this covariance, this is the covariance. It's dropping, okay, between the late 90s, early 2000s, and after the recession, okay, financial crisis. I should be explicit. Okay, it's falling. This is happening everywhere. Okay, this is a bunch of across a ton of countries. This is all from 2000 to 2020. This is Europe. Okay, this isn't Europe's not everywhere. Okay, it's happening everywhere. Another part of that is it's happening in Europe, which is part of everywhere. Okay, huge declines. Okay, and so we're seeing declines kind of everywhere. And so we need to keep it in perspective, and the U.S. has declined relatively less. And that decline is still it's still above in terms of reallocation these other countries. Okay? And actually, if we look forward, we look past the recession. Sorry, if you look more recently, a bunch of these numbers, excess separations, quits, these kind of churn of labor markets have gone back up. They were declining for a long time, and they've come back up since COVID. It's not just COVID, it's in through 2022. We don't have the 2023 data yet, but it seems to be good. Okay? So it's definitely down. It's not as much reallocation, but it's still relatively high. Final challenge, productivity has declined, so that's prosperity is not as good, and so there has to be something that's happening to competition. Okay? Not has to, but it's likely that there's something happening to competition. So that's disputing kind of the right side. Markets in the U.S. are doing well. This is absolutely true. Was absolutely true. If we look at average labor productivity, looking from after the war, through 2015. Okay, again, trying to use just stuff I can pull off from other papers. Looking more recently, 95 to 2004 versus the decade after. Labor productivity was growing at 2.8%, then it was growing at 1.2%. And this is a big difference. This amounts to about $3 trillion a year in 2015, okay, if growth had stayed where it was. So growth was going like this, it flattened out. If it had stayed on that one, we'd be about $3 trillion richer in 2015. Okay? That's about a sixth of the economy. It's a big, the slowdown was real and it mattered, and it was devastating. Okay, but again, that I'm not showing you everywhere. Since 2000, the U.S., which is this top one, has been doing way better than anyone else. Okay, doesn't mean there's not a problem, but there may be something going on that's not about U.S.'s level of competition. There's something else going on, and what I'll argue is going on. Okay. And I'll take this from another paper, take this argument from some other economists, is that we're in the process, this is a regular churn of the economy, of moving towards a different general purpose technology, AI and machine learning, okay? And I'll stop here because I want to get to questions, but in these sorts of reallocations to a new way of doing things, we have in the past seen slowdowns, okay? For example, when portable power, okay, the internal combustion engine and electrification, as that was coming onto the economy in 1890, productivity was low for a long time, and then it took off in the blue line. Okay. Why it take a while? It takes, these technological progress isn't immediate. Okay. So in 1919, about 30 years after it was commercially available, something like a third of plants, manufacturing plants, were not electrified. And manufacturing is like on the cutting edge of these things. So it takes a long time for things to be updated and for firms to get to this stuff. If you look in the 70s through the 2000s, we see a similar thing with IT. Computers seem to be doing nothing for a long time. boom, they take off, and then productivity takes off. Okay, so we see these ebbs and flows. My argument isn't that AI and machine learning are going to do exactly that. Okay, but the fact that we've seen it before, these are waves along this upward trend, and I have every reason to believe that that's still what's going on. And actually, if you look very recently at productivity growth, it's picked back up. Okay, it picked up during after COVID, it came back down, it's back up against trend. This is very noisy data, I wouldn't put too much on this, but it hasn't plummeted, okay? So again, that's my argument. In summary, what are the causes of U.S. competitiveness and therefore U.S. economic growth and prosperity? Decade over decade, we didn't see any changes, so we can't really point to things that are changing regularly. It's not about the presidential party, the congressional party. Democrats, Republicans, boom, still going up. Was about tax reform, Reagan tax cuts, Bush tax cuts, still going up. Wasn't about like the introduction of big government programs like Medicare. Didn't kill this. In the increasing of taxes that came along with it, didn't kill this. There's one exception that I think maybe did help it. And even my area, antitrust policy. I think antitrust in the US right now is very good. I thought it was very bad in 1970 overall. Didn't have an impact on this sort of stuff, okay? Overall, it's a broader piece. I didn't talk about this piece. We need peace. We need capital markets. We have a large single market that helps. But probably the most important one that can vary and can go away if things change is flexible labor markets. The ability to reallocate from this firm to this firm means that this firm's got to be able to hire workers. Okay? So we need that to happen, and that's where a lot of countries fall behind. Okay? And you need to be able to succeed, make money, make a profit. Taxes can't be. In other words, little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Thank you. If you want to read more, I have a newsletter, some things over there, and I have academic papers you can look at there. But questions? Yeah.
Sorry if you covered this one. Came in a little late.
No worries.
So, European Union and trying to really suppress AI right now, I guess you could say. Do you think that'll cause greater differentiation between U.S. competitiveness and theirs if we don't go on the same path?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends what it looks like. My colleagues know more about the European Union than I do, but they just had some big announcement that looked bad from what I heard about it. Very easy to kill these sorts of things. It'd be on par with trying to shut down IT, portable power distribution. Okay, portable power right away caused a lot of fires. And if the U.S. government would have said, okay, we're going to stop this from rolling out, or you need a ton of approval, that would have slowed things down. Absolutely. Now, is that going to be everything? Is the EU AI Act going to cover all the sort of applications in practice? Maybe not. Maybe it's actually really tailored to a few aspects. The generative AI, especially, people are worried about, and maybe it doesn't really affect other machine learning things that help, the things that come up with the protein folding and things like that. So it matters the actual implementation for sure. Other questions? Yeah.
What industries are probably going to be using AI the most?
Yeah. Information technologies and communications are going to be the one most direct. Now, the interesting thing about general purpose technologies is that by their nature, why you call them general purpose, is that they're not just impacting that industry. Okay, portable power did not just impact power plants. It impacted manufacturing most directly, but then spills over to everything else, right? Offices are more productive if you can run that stuff. So it spills over, and it's hard to differentiate. But definitely the things that are going to be most closely related is what's now called information technology. That's where you see the investment right now. The real growth effects are going to be when it's not confined to that. Okay, when you're and this is the thing, you don't know these things ahead of time, but the way your restaurant is able to use some algorithm for how they order supplies and stuff, that's going to reduce their costs and things like that. So it's all about these spillovers, or the follow-ups. That's why you have the low productivity for a long time, and then, okay, everyone's on board, right? Everyone has computers now, sort of thing. Oops. Other questions? Yeah.
What do you think is the fundamental, or like are the fundamental differences between the United States and like the European countries?
Yeah. Go. Sorry about this. I knew I'd go too far. So they have, until recently, a lot of peace. Now, not so true. So that's a big difference, especially when you look at the recent data. But this stuff is held before the recent data. Okay. The real big ones are going to be the flexible labor markets, the ease in which you need to be able to fire people. People need to be able to quit and find a new job. Okay, that has to happen for there to be churn. So if you have like, I know Spain, I know a little bit more about. It's very hard to fire people, especially if they've been there for very long. That slows down reallocation. Okay, you also have high unemployment, things like that. I don't think the big gap. There's some about the way that things are taxed. There's a little less incentive, but I really think that the flexible labor markets matter. Capital markets, I think we don't. This one is not backed by serious research. So the U.S. is in a unique spot as the reserve currency of the world. You know, U.S. investments overall are in a very good spot. Capital markets work very well. There's a lot of inflow of capital. Okay, surely that impacts entrepreneurship in a way, you know. But I don't know the details of that magnitude, because the euro is not like the euro is, you know, some currency that no one uses. Yeah.
On antitrust, you said it's not always that more companies are necessarily more efficient. So, for example, right now there seems to be a ramp up in the amount of lawsuits being brought by the Justice Department and antitrust. Right now, I think they're suing Google, and they just blocked a merger between Spirit Airlines and JetBlue Airlines. How do you see this current kind of policy and how it might affect?
So they're bringing about the same amount of cases. They're bringing some high impact cases, which is whether it's good or bad, they're big cases. The FTC, DOJ at the end of President Trump's DOJ sued Google under search. There's another Google case. The FTC has just sued Amazon, their big Amazon case. So those big headline-grabbing ones seem to be up. The number of cases is actually not up. It's about the same. There's some ways of measuring where it is up a little bit, but it's actually not so drastic. And this is something that kind of cuts against my day-to-day argument. I've been very vocal in my criticism of the DOJ antitrust division under Jonathan Cantor and the FTC under Chair Khan. So far, they haven't done a lot. They haven't done a lot different than the previous administration, so it's hard to see what would happen. Whatever they do, as bad as I think a lot of it is, as much as I argue against them, and I think the Amazon case is a poorly thought out one, I think the Google search one by the DOJ was a poorly thought out one, it's not going to change this. This is, that's peanuts compared to this sort of stuff. But I'll still argue, I mean, it still matters. We're still talking about, billions of dollars. $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you'll be having real money. That's a joke. Okay, never mind. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I know you know Peter Boettke, and actually I remember you used to say that, kind of making a very similar, very general argument that you are making here, and you used to say, as long as kind of public choice, rent-seeking problems are outpaced by the Adam Smith Division of Labor benefits and Schumpeter kind of entrepreneurship, creative destruction benefits, we end up ahead, right? And I think that's a kind of elegant, simple, general way to think about these things, so that all these government programs tend to slow us down, but as long as these Smithian and Schumpeterian forces are able to outpace them, we're still going to be doing well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It doesn't mean that's always true. Like the Eastern Europe examples change that, especially early in the transition. UK, Germany seem to have reversed that the rent seeking has slowed down a lot. In the US, the big problem is with local zoning, that you see productivity in things like construction plummeting. So it's in that industry, the public choice issues seem to have dominated, right? But in the U.S. overall, it seems to not be the case. Could it be the case eventually? Of course. My worry with that argument is to what extent I'm defining things as like things that speed up and things that slow down, and then yes, of course. Like, is rent seeking just all the things that are? Is rent seeking just a bad thing? Like, am I if I think it's bad, or because it slows down productivity, slows down reallocation, therefore I'm going to call it rent seeking. I wonder if it's a circular argument, but it's how I think about things. But it's this weird tension, and I'll stop it. Allow more questions here. Like, I argue against a lot of different policies because I think that they're going to encourage rent seeking. They're going to be destructive. I probably, if I would have been of age, I probably would have been arguing against the different Medicare expansions, say the Part D or maybe in the original. Turns out that it didn't seem to be that big of a drag, but maybe it is. I don't know. Taxes, I generally will argue for lower taxes, and would be arguing against any tax increase. Doesn't seem to be a big drag.
Is it possible it is, but just no other major country is doing better?
Yeah, so absolutely it's possible it is. My worry with that argument is that I see it all the time from people that I disagree with, let's say in antitrust. They say, oh yes, prices have fallen from Amazon, retail prices have plummeted. Amazon is, quality has gone up, but if Amazon had not done XYZ, this is like the FTC case on the integration, if Amazon had not integrated shipping with their ad business, okay, in the platform, prices would have fallen even more. Sure, it's possible. I'm skeptical. When I see prices plummeting a lot, my first reaction isn't, well, they probably could have plummeted more. Similarly, if I see, it's the same thing, prices plummeting. If I see GDP increasing a lot, my first reaction isn't, well, it could have gone even more. There's nowhere I've seen it go more, so I'm not sure. In other words, I get very annoyed with people I disagree with holding out a hypothetical world that they imagine to be better. How do I not make that same argument myself? My inclination is exactly that. Like, things would be better. If antitrust in the 60s would have been even better, we would have had even more of a boom. Maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to keep myself honest on that. I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you again for speaking. Thank you.